Welcome to the Live Your Purpose podcast, featuring compelling interviews with big-hearted people in the Oklahoma City metro area who are leading, creating, and innovating on purpose. Get inspired by conversations with passionate difference makers from our local community. I'm your host, Charles Gossett, life purpose coach and founder of Full Integration Coaching. On today's episode, we sit down with David Lee Anderson, an artist, actor, and musician who has spent a lifetime dedicated to learning and growing through the arts and through the journey of life itself. And now, the Live Your Purpose podcast. Welcome to this edition of the Live Your Purpose podcast. Today, I'm here with David Lee Anderson, an artist who has worked in commercial art, publication, fine art, illustration, and has been a part-time art and illustration teacher. He also worked as a musician, singer, guitarist, and songwriter, and is currently working as an actor for films and commercials. David Lee illustrated paperback and magazine covers, board game art, and computer game art for national and international science fiction and fantasy publication for 35 years. He was the artist guest of honor for 23 science fiction and fantasy conventions around the country and displayed art at more than 440 science fiction art shows. He is currently doing hyper-realistic fine art paintings for corporate and private commissions of historical buildings and landscapes based in Oklahoma. David Lee has a dozen credits acting in films so far on IMDB and has been in more than 35 films, short films, and commercials since 2013. You can see his fine art on Facebook at facebook.com/davidlee8.anderson and his science fiction and fantasy illustration at davidleeanderson.com. David Lee, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Charles. I appreciate it.
It's so good to be here. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation. And I should say, we're on location here in your home studio, which has a really interesting story in and of itself.
Yes, this studio is in what was my grandmother's family home. I think my dad was born when they first bought the house in 1931, and the upstairs studio used to be called the dormitory. It was the bedroom of my father's two sisters and one brother, and they each lived in the corner of this space. But my grandfather built the space, and so a lot of the pencil marks of where he cut the wood and so on are still here. In another way, I have been in this as a studio for almost 40 years. So
wow, yeah.
This is, it's also got the north third of the studio is my wife's sewing nook, and she does a lot of sewing for her hobbies. She just made 3 shirts for our grandson yesterday, and I'm really, she's about as good at sewing things as I am at doing art.
Well, see, now I know that. So does she take custom orders? Because
I think so.
I may have one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's really cool. Well, thanks for sharing that. And as you know, we start each episode with a kickoff question.
Right.
And you've chosen yours, so we'll ask that and just see where the conversation takes us.
Okay.
Okay. So David Lee, when did you know that you wanted to be doing what you're doing today?
I can specifically point out a time. It was in 4th grade in New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
I was a student there at the White Sands Missile Range School, was the elementary school there. And we had a visiting instructor, art instructor, that would come perhaps once a week. I can't really remember specifically, but he had us do artwork in projects that were certain media and material that he would have and concentrated on that. And he entered some of our artwork into an art show in Las Cruces. And one of my pieces won $60 for the school in art supplies, which in 1961 or 63 was an awful lot of money at that time.
Right.
And it seemed like, it would be, several $100 right now. But it opened my eyes to, whoa, people will give you money for this? And from that time, I think I had always known I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be an artist for a living, but I didn't really know how to go about it. And so it was a long process of education. I think that the thing that I love most is learning new things.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I spent many years studying illustration on my own. I was working as a commercial artist in Baltimore in the early 70s, and I went to the library and checked out books on illustration, checked out books on graphic design, learned things as I went. I worked as an artist doing paste up and design for graphics for a company called Garamond Pridemark that was a full-service printing company. And as people had quit in the art department, I took over their jobs because I wanted to learn everything, all the aspects of design, and that way I could stick in illustration when customers would come that wanted drawings for the cover, or drawings for a calendar, or illustrations for a book that was being printed. So I worked there for about 3 or 4 years and learned everything I could, and then ended up being the sole person in the art department. What's interesting about this is the printing background gave me much more awareness and knowledge of how things get printed, so that I went to the printers themselves and asked them, how do you do this 4-color process? Mm-hmm. They would tell me that these negatives aren't bright enough, or they aren't useful for you need to do this or you need to do that. And so each person in the various departments, I learned from how to make the color bright enough to reproduce well, and so on. So I have a tendency to paint in very bright colors because when I did paperbacks later, that was what was necessary. Was my knowledge working for printing companies helped me a lot in having my work reproduce really well. Mm-hmm. So, but the main thing was doing art for a living was kind of my main drive.
Yeah, and all that started back in the 4th grade.
Yes.
There you were in White Sands, right? New
Yes.
Mexico. And you had a visiting art teacher. And so I was curious just to look at that a little bit more. What else do you remember that can you tell us about this instructor? I mean, certainly you were taught art, but also this opportunity to have your art viewed and seen by the public competitively, and judged, and you won this award. What other role did this art instructor play for you in terms of learning techniques, or just as an influence?
Well, I don't remember. I remember it was a man who, most of our teachers were women, mm-hmm. In the 60s particularly. So yeah. It was a male instructor, which kind of, got your attention at that time. Mm-hmm. He was very good with kids. I think he taught, probably all grades, and I'm not certain if he was an instructor for the Las Cruces public school system, or whether he was an independent person who just, they hired him to do it at these schools. But it was that moment, I think, that made me realize that art was valuable. Mm-hmm. It was just that I was later. I remember though that the illustration that won the award mm-hmm. was done with color crayons on kind of heavy paper, and then you would take a black crayon and cover the whole thing over till it was black, and then we incised it with a little metal. It's sort of like the end of a compass, only this tool was just used to etch out the illustration. And I remember making a New Mexico landscape, I think, with this etching. So I remember specifically the piece and the materials that were used for it.
Yeah.
Later I went on to, basically I did black and white because I wanted to be a comic book artist.
Okay.
And
what inspired that, by the way? So yeah, there's a little shift of focus
Yeah.
somewhere for you. And were you reading comic books, I'm assuming, and
Yes.
thinking, hey, I'd like to do some of that?
Yes, I think
Okay.
by the 6th grade I was reading comic books. So this is just, a couple years later.
Yeah.
I was collecting comics, and those were the first. Marvel had been printing comics for a while, but in the early 60s they had this sort of revolution that happened in 63 and 64, 65. They invented a bunch of characters like Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and the Hulk, and the superhero genre was kind of blossomed all of a sudden, and they call that the golden age now, and or I mean the silver age.
Okay.
The golden age was the 30s, and the silver age was this kind of blossoming of the publication and different kinds of characters and characters with problems, and a kid with his Aunt May was taking care of Peter Parker, and he was taking care of her, and they would have difficulties, and high school, being in high school, and so on. And a lot of this just hit home to a whole generation of us.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my focus for probably the next 10 years, was to become a comic book artist.
Yeah. Well, and so just to touch one more time back on the early experience, the reason I asked, one of the reasons I asked about the 4th grade experience with this art instructor is because as folks tune into these episodes, often there will be influencers in our lives.
Yes.
And what we remember isn't as important is that they did influence us in some way. And so that's why I asked that follow-up question. And just to know that there was this male that was unusual, a male student who was good with kids. Somebody who could reach you where you're at and teach you some new skills, and this early love of learning that maybe you adopted. And then to take it all the way to this point of competition and seeing that, hey, wait a minute, I could be making money doing this.
Right.
And then I love the segue into the comic book world and thinking that this is what you became interested. There was relevance for you. Again, there were themes going on, not only these cool illustrations and amazing characters, but there were themes that a whole generation could relate to in those
Well, it was
times.
storytelling.
Yeah, storytelling, right.
It was storytelling with pictures.
Yeah.
So for me, I was also interested in writing. I was
Okay.
also interested in creating my own characters and doing my own comic book versions of things. I didn't care to as much to copy what what had already been published. I was more interested in creating something new. And I remember working on publication. I did art for my school newspaper when I lived in Germany, and they were mimeographs, where you etched into an almost carbon surface that was real similar to the etching that I had done, a couple of years earlier for the painting that won the prize. And so it was this transition into one thing leads to the next, because the comic books had interested me mostly, but it was the storytelling aspect of it.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to do most of my art later related to storytelling with sequential drawings. And that's the idea behind animation. And I got into animation, doing drawings, multiple, tracings and so on, to make characters move in amateur films that I did that were in later years. But that all tied together, where the storytelling aspect and the sense of animation, that comic books are basically like storyboards for movies. fact, they're done by a lot of the same artists, or do storyboards for the planning sessions of films. And I was especially interested, I think at the same time, now that I think about it, one of the main influences on me in art was my mother took me to Las Cruces to see a movie called Fantasia. And Fantasia, I think, was one of those life experience things that just change your whole perspective. And it made me, it tied together two of my great loves, which was classical music, music in general, and storytelling with pictures. So, but this was a re-release that was probably one of the first times that Disney had re-released a movie that did not do that well at the box office when it was first out. But this whole generation of the, let's say the hippie generation, all of a sudden this took off again because it was visual and linear, but at the same time it was tied together with the aspect of multimedia, and that the interest that I had was my mother introduced me to classical music. And she would go to the Post Library and get records for us to listen to. And she'd, say, this is Tchaikovsky, 1812 Overture. And they're using real cannons in the background in this, in this recording. And for her, that was, it was very important for me. Another life change was this period, which was the same time that I had realized that people would pay money for art. And so that influenced me towards comic book illustration, because a lot of the illustrations from Walt Disney were very akin to comic book illustration.
Right.
So that's the kind of change you see in Connections. I don't know if you remember the old television show Connections, was early 80s, about the same time as Carl Sagan's Cosmos.
Oh yeah, sure.
There was a British based show that was showing the technology and cultural changes that would happen that all bounce off each other. And this chain of events leads to new technology, which we now are using in being able to record our own conversation right now.
Exactly.
So the animation led me to wanting to do cartoons. And my dad had given me a book called Fun with a Pencil. And Andrew Loomis was the author's name. He was also an animator for Walt Disney at one time.
Okay.
So you see these
I do.
kinds of connections.
Yeah.
And so I used this book. That's how I learned perspective. And I was probably, 9 or 10 at the time that I was learning these things. And I paid attention to models and how you draw them, and they'd show you modular systems of creating ovals for the heads and shaping the body and so on, which led to the kind of comic book illustration that many of us were in the 60s were influenced by the comic book illustrators, because they were doing the same thing as the animators were doing. So, and they crossed over in the fields with each other. So this was a good background, certainly for learning how to do storytelling with images.
Yeah. What I find so interesting, all of it, but specifically the connections. You mentioned the word connections, and I'm a big connection seer also, and I think a lot of artists and creatives are. And so to see some of these other influencers crop up, which is for our listeners, that's one of the purposes of the Live Your Purpose podcast, is so that folks listening in can key into their own narrative, their own life story, and maybe pick up some of those early influencers that they may have forgotten about or undervalued, or maybe they do remember, and this gives them another appreciation. So, but you also were gaining technical skills. You were finding out that storytelling mattered, that illustrating mattered, and that music mattered. All of these things that you've been doing for a few years now.
Right.
Right. So, and then at some point you were in Baltimore. This was part of your sharing, that you were in Baltimore and you were the head of this department of.
Yeah, I was the head of the department, except I was only one person. So,
You were the department.
Yeah, I was the department.
I can relate. Yeah.
And
So-
that actually continued because
Okay.
when I moved out to Oklahoma from Baltimore, I did the same thing here for a printing company where I was the sole artist. I had actually worked, but the printing companies, it was interesting because I learned how to design books. That was one of the main kind of you learn things that you don't know you're going to need until later.
So
and
true.
that was always remembering where something came from and then thinking, oh yeah, I remember learning that from the printing company that I worked in Baltimore. So useful. You kind of add things to the whole mix of what you know and what you're interested in. I think what I have to mention that another very strong influence, and this was, I may explain first, my dad was in the Army, so I lived in various bases and sometimes in the local community, depended on whether they had housing for us or whatever. But I'm the oldest of 11 children.
Right.
And so moving that family, and I have 9 sisters and one brother. And so this experience being in the Army, my dad being in the Army and moving around, gave me a lot of cultural exposure to other parts of the country. And then moving to Germany was yet another completely alien environment that I thrived in my art at that time because the country was filled with buildings that were 1,000 years old. And that it just was kind of epic in scope that I took in all of this. But I was introduced to J.R.R. Tolkien by a teacher when I was in 6th grade there in Germany that read us the first several chapters of The Hobbit. And so that interest in fantasy, because they had real castles there,
Yeah.
we would go on field trips, and I would see art and architecture and things that I would have never been exposed to had I not been a kid that was an Army brat. So there's a lot of things. I'm sure that there's other people listening that probably had some of those experiences themselves.
Yeah.
And when I run across other people whose dad were in the Air Force or parents moved around because of they have another viewpoint about things, and I think it's interesting because you broaden your horizons with every experience that you have, but these things all formulated a kind of plan of action in my case.
Yeah.
And I was continuing to paint and not painting well at that time, but in 6th and 7th and 8th grade was working with different materials and learning what I liked most. What I was really good at or became good at was black and white work with pencil, pen and ink, because that was what comic book artists, that's the basis of the comic book page.
Right.
And so I refined that skill to a more professional level. By the time that I was in high school, I was doing illustration for school newspapers. I was doing cartoons in the school newspapers. I was getting things published, in a amateur fashion but knowing how things were reproduced and getting using early mimeographs and ditto machines and so on. I think that's what led me later to be working for printing companies and so on, because I had had that graphic skill and then just built layer upon layer with that. Doing illustration and doing the art part was my main goal, and eventually I got to that. But I have to explain that, being a kid moving around with a large family, that in itself is a unique experience that a lot of people, may not understand how what the dynamic is for that. And so I was a caretaker for my younger sisters, just like a babysitter. I changed diapers, I fed kids, and that was one of those skill sets that you learn as you're going along. Later, I went to college part-time, and it took me 13 years to get a degree. But when I got married, my wife, Carolyn, she decided that I needed to complete my degree, because by that time, I think I'd worked for about 8 years, going part-time while I was working full-time.
Okay, yeah.
And so I would do 2 classes a semester or something like that. And so I had this, I was still in my freshman year, I think, by that time, but she allowed me to go to school when we first got married. And that was that was such an awesome experience, because I'd worked by then for 10 years in the commercial art industry, and I was, knew what I wanted to do. And that was a blessing. And a large aspect of my going to school was that I was an adult and I knew what I wanted to do, and I was sometimes 10 years older than some of my fellow students who usually fool around for a couple of years before they actually know what they're doing, or what they want to do. And
you have these life experiences.
I knew what I wanted to do.
Yes.
So when I went to school, I was ready, and everything I learned, it's strange, because some of the things you don't know you need. I had to take a business class, as part of the general degree. And I thought, oh God. And I took a marketing class, which I didn't realize would help me create my own business many years later. But you don't know those things are going to be valuable to you. But you put that all in your toolkit, and keep everything. Then you can recall, a product has a lifespan. It has a certain audience that you're trying to reach. It's, and all these things that focus you on the business aspect of something. And of course, artists are notorious for being poor businessmen. And I think that business people helped us in a sense, thinking, oh, yeah, okay, think of this as a product, And because I'd been a commercial artist and been selling 7-Eleven posters and people's business cards and letterheads and brochures and annual reports for companies and that sort of thing, I knew that these all had a purpose, that there was something, there was an end result that people were getting, and they were paying you for it.
Right. By the way, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so one of the things I wanted to highlight here, David Lee, is that you've said this a couple of times, and I'm thinking this is a tip for those that are keying into this part of it. You may have already, but if not, what you've said a couple of times is that, these things that you do along the way, that you learn along the way, these are, in essence, the skills that you pick up, the influences that you have in your life, the transformative experiences that you have. These are all part of your toolkit. And you have access to this later on. We may or may not know. Most of us don't. I don't know what's ahead in the future. But, I can definitely relate to what David Lee, what you're sharing about these experiences that you had earlier on, and you were able to pick up from those and grow with them, to utilize them in ways that you probably never thought possible when it all came down to it. there's so many unknowns, but you knew some things. You certainly knew you wanted to be illustrating. You knew you could make money doing this. You knew that you wanted to have expertise in the black and white, this
Yes.
foundational component. So became an expert in that area. And then you were able to go back to college, or maybe you were coerced to go to college and get your degree. But man, were you ready for it?
I was allowed to go back to college.
You were allowed. Okay, there's the right word.
Right.
Okay.
Well, the things that you don't know you need, a lot of times you can run across experiences that don't seem to make a difference right away.
Right.
And then years later, I had color theory classes, which I just, I didn't get it. I didn't understand. I understand light rays and the sense of colors being all a part of a prism and so on. That you're seeing different refractions, different reflections, and so on. But it didn't occur to me until I was seriously painting what that meant. And 10 years later or 15 years later, those things come out.
Yeah.
But I want to digress a little back to influences.
Sure.
One of the main things that influenced me in art, and this may seem odd, but it was another movie. 2001: A Space Odyssey was one of those things like Fantasia that just blew me away completely. And the film was not a success at the time it came out. And I saw it in its debut in 1968. I was stunned with the illusions of reality that they were able to create with models. And I saw the paintings that were used for the posters, and that was, very influential in my later work doing science fiction and fantasy illustration. And this was from 1968. And I didn't start doing science fiction illustration until 1980.
Okay, yeah.
So you see the cause and effect is sometimes delayed, but at the same time, I knew specifically that I wanted to go in this certain direction and learn these things, and I applied myself to whatever it was to learn that. And I think as an artist, you have to do art. A writer, you have to write. You're a photographer, you've got to take pictures. You have to do everything and do it over and over. And you must allow yourself to fail. That's one of the biggest things. My daughter, Julia Anderson Holt, is a chemistry teacher at Bishop McGuinness. She says the kids that she teaches, they don't feel like they can fail. And she said, you've got to fail. In science, you have to try stuff. Does it work? If it works, fine, you go on to the next step. If it doesn't, you try to find out why it doesn't work. And this is the case with being an artist or a musician or a writer or any kind of creator. You've got to be able to do it and accept failure as that's a learning point. You go on from there. You try to take that and make it, or you try to make it work, whatever it is.
Yeah, depending on the situation, right?
But you go on from there. And I think that that's one of the things that I had no fear of failure, because I allowed myself to do stuff that wasn't really up to par. And a lot of times I think, no, I didn't do that on purpose, but I could see that, my heart wasn't in it, or I didn't have the right materials, or some sort of function that you get to that point where you want to throw something away. Well, my wife, Carolyn, she's, certainly, she's not an artist, and she's not a creator in the sense of, except for her sewing skills. And but she understands. She said she saw a painting all folded up that was on illustration board, so sort of paper, and put in the trash. And then later she saw it pulled out and laid out on the table again with another attempt to fix this. Yeah. So, I say you have to be able to want to, create, but you've got to be able to learn from your experiences. So
yeah, that is so important, and for artists, for creatives, for human beings. And I've noticed that trend in schools, especially with high achieving, high performing
yes.
individuals. It can really be a trap that when we're used to, I was high achieving growing up in school, and it was a way that I had a sense of control. It was a way
yes.
I felt achievement or important. And when I achieved less than what I thought was possible or what I thought I ought to, there was this critical, self-critical
yes.
component that would actually inhibit me from trying again and having a really poor self-image. And so fast forward several years, what you're saying now is absolutely truth. If anybody out there is doubting it, please re-examine your experience, whether you're an artist, a creative, a scientist, whatever you're doing, a leader. Failure and mistakes are absolutely essential to growth.
Yes.
Because if you're always winning and always succeeding, you're not learning new things.
Yes.
You may be applying things in new ways, but you're really not learning new information that's going to allow you to assess the situation and respond in creative ways. Creativity, inevitably, over and over. All the books I've read, all the documentaries I've seen about artists and musicians and other creatives, mistakes are made. And guess what? Oh, we didn't expect that to happen in the recording studio. And that's exactly the sound that they needed. Nobody meant to do it.
Yeah.
And it's just what they were looking for. So never undervalue the mistakes that you've made either. It's a completely different mindset. So I appreciate that you're sharing that now.
Well, in retrospect, you look at it from science. If they didn't make those mistakes, you wouldn't have vulcanized rubber. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't have many of the technologies that we have discovered. In some cases, were accidents in the first place that turned out to be beneficial adaptations. Mm-hmm. And so that's the kind of thing. I think it took me a long while. I've been working at this a while, so to be patient with myself. Mm. That is one of the worst critiques that I can make about creative people, mm-hmm. is that they're too hard on themselves, And as I got older, it got less important that I make this work exactly like I thought it was going to be, mm-hmm. because it's in the process, and art is a process. It's a layering of colors to create something. What my wife calls this is the first time I have a drawing that has black and white illustration on it ready to be painted. Well, the first stage is filling in all the white spaces with color. Well, that's called the ugly stage, because it's hideous. It's all layered, not exactly the right colors, but you have to do that first to get on top of those, to color over things, to blend in stuff, to develop it. It's all like it's like a time machine. That you put that many hours into something, and I know I can do 24 by 36 painting. I could fill it in 4 hours with painting in all the white spaces, but it takes me 3 more weeks to refine that, to get that to work, to make it look like I want it to look. And in some cases, there's experiments that I have to make on these paintings that I'm working on right now. There are adjustments that I've been making in the pavement. The pavement is gray. It's concrete. But I've painted it over several times trying to get this effect to make it look like concrete, but not have anybody notice it.
Ah, okay, yeah.
to make it look, and it's all what looks like blank color, gray, but it has to be sort of modeled and textured. And I spend sometimes as many hours on things like that as I do all the little details in window reflections, or all the little details of thousands and thousands of leaves on a tree or something like that, that I can spend that much time on something that is something people won't notice, in the sense. And I want that to be that case. I want them to focus in on the details and the reality that I'm trying to represent in the painting. But they don't know that I spent maybe days on doing things like the concrete. So it's just, you have to be patient, both with the project you're working on at the moment and the whole thing. You can't be trying to rush things to get to the end.
Yeah.
You have to, and luckily with these projects, I don't have a deadline, which is really, really unusual for an artist, especially a commercial artist.
Mm-hmm.
Everything I had for 35 years had to be done at a certain time.
Yeah.
And usually it was yesterday.
For sure.
So I'd worked under pressure for so many years that now I'm having to switch gears. My wife told me, Carolyn said, well, you aren't allowed to retire. And I thought, well, I don't want to be retired. I want to keep on doing what I'm doing and get better at it.
Yeah, yeah.
And so she points out that I haven't had a real job since 1980. So, but among other things, I have done childcare for my kids. My three kids had a dad at home, and I worked with them. And then sometimes I would have to hire babysitters, especially when they got to the troublesome ages, of needing attention constantly. And now I'm doing daycare for my grandson, which is, basically my own sisters I took care of. My kids were raised with a dad at home, and now my grandchild Sebastian is in the studio, as you can see here.
Yeah, he's got his toys and his play mat
and his baby cage.
He's all set up.
He's all set up. But he's a year and a half old, but he demands attention at all times as well. So it's interesting to balance these things.
Yeah, I'm sure that it is. Well, I know that it is because you've told me some about it just now, but we've met a couple of times, and I've met Sebastian, and boy, he's full of energy and curious, like anybody that age will be.
Yeah,
so,
this kid is. I've gotten old enough now that it's a lot more work than I remember it being. As a young parent, you just don't know what you just deal with it every day.
Right. This is how it is.
That's it. You're and three kids, I remember having different stages. I had a boy, Nathan, who is now a stand-up comic in New York. My daughter, Julia, who I mentioned before, is the head of the science department at Bishop McGinnis. She teaches AP chemistry. And this is one thing you mentioned about kids with high demands on themselves. She's teaching that group.
I see.
The AP. And my youngest, Emma, is she's a marketing manager, but basically a graphic designer for BDO, which is an international company that does the accounting for huge businesses. And so she's the only one of my three who actually has been doing art. It's all graphics, it's all on computers and so on, but that's how it's done these days. So,
yeah, that's right.
But at any rate, the things that they grew up with a dad who painted spaceships and wizards, so it was interesting. And in some cases, I volunteered at Rosary School. They didn't have an art teacher, so I did what the teacher in Las Cruces was doing I did with kids at Rosary School for about 3 years. And I volunteered my time to go up there once every other week, I think, and I taught kindergarten through 8th grade. And it was partly because my kids were there at that school, but it was also that, boy, that was another thing I learned. You know, teaching art, it was more interesting to many of the kids because they were able to draw spaceships and dragons and underground treasure hunts and stuff that, you know, interested them more than drawing a still life or something. So, you know, I had a good response from that, and because of that, I got hired by one of the kids' dads was the academic vice president at OCU, and so he got me a position as an adjunct faculty teaching illustration
Wow.
at OCU for from 99. It was 7 semesters from 1990 to 96.
Yeah. Well, David Lee, we've covered a lot of territory in this last several minutes. And so as we kind of wrap up here and come to a close, I did want to reflect back some of what I got from you. This 2001 Space Odyssey was a
Yes.
huge influence on you, as was Fantasia, and these early influences on you, these teachers in your life, comic books themselves, classical music played at home. And I wanted to make sure and rephrase this again because I thought it was so important for me, and I think a lot of creatives and people that are hard on themselves. You know, if you're creative and academically gifted or rigorous, that describes me. You're double hard on yourself. You
Yes.
know, it's more than likely. And so this aspect of patience and having patience with yourself. And so you're hearing it from an accomplished artist, somebody who's been doing this for a little while now and is highly skilled and getting great commissions, and patience is key. So I think there's an illusion for a lot of us creatives, if I can just keep driving and push this out and get this process done, you know, you're going to be fighting with yourself a lot.
Right.
I've recognized that. You know, this business that I'm doing involves a lot of creativity and unknowns. And, you know, the more harder I am on myself, the less good I am at, you know, doing the next thing, finding innovative solutions, and just being resilient. So great point there. There's going to be an ugly stage to your work. There's going to be an ugly stage to your life. You know, if you're
Right.
like me,
Exactly.
that happens. And so these are lessons really that apply to, I think, the full scope of humanity. You know, there's going to be, you can take time to focus on different aspects of your life, different aspects of yourself. And David Lee has hit several here towards the end of caretaking, you know, taking care of what matters to you, providing that influence to those that you love, you know, having great relationships, being there for people. And just paying attention, you know, just paying attention to what's there, whether it's on the canvas or a loved one that's across from you. And then in closing, David Lee, I did want to give you the opportunity. I know you've got some amazing work going here right now, and you've got all these acting gigs and these movies. I wanted to give you just a couple of minutes to say, you know, what are you working on lately? Where can folks see your work in the community? And we'll provide links as well, but just, you know, just a couple of highlights there to close.
Well, I have been acting in movies since 2013. It was an opportunity in the newspaper. I think I read an ad that was not an ad, but a blurb about a casting call, and I just told Carolyn I was going to go up and apply for this thing because I'd always wanted to do movies. I actually was in a movie club when I was in 10th and 11th grade that we created movies ourselves. So that had always been important to me in my life. But, you know, I was in my late 50s. I turned 60 the first year I took classes to learn how to act. And it was something that I was actually pretty good at, and mainly because I dedicate myself to learning. I take classes at a a facility called Actor Factory, who are also casting agents. It's called Freihofer Casting. And I worked, with that for the last few years as another thing to learn. And so it's been very helpful. Right now I'm doing a commission for a corporation that I'm doing paintings of their historical buildings, which is something I've been doing since 2013, actually. I started the acting and doing these fine art illustrations about the same time. And I had shown art at the Festival of the Arts downtown, and I continue to do that show. So you can see my art at the Festival of the Arts in 2020. It's in late April. In fact, that's where I met Charles in the first place.
That's right.
That it is a interesting experience. I do better selling art to professionals. I'm not really that good at being a dealer in a sense, but I got to talk to several thousand people all in 1 week, probably tens of thousands in a way. The Arts Festival has 750,000 people, I think, attend this arts festival. So I get to expose, that's how I was exposed to getting commissions from some of these corporations. So you can see my art there. Charles also mentioned my Facebook page. I'd like you to be able to contact me. I will give you my email, actually. It's davidlee8, the number 8, @juno.com. And I do email, every day. It's partly how I get casting calls and so on. So I'm always on it, and I have an Instagram, but I don't post much on it. So if you're interested in adding me, it's davidlee8, spelled out, David Lee, one word, EIGHT is my handle on Instagram. Facebook, Charles mentioned it before. It'll be listed in the program notes. So you can see my fine art work on Facebook. You can see my science fiction illustration, as many years worth of illustration, but there's samples on davidleeanderson.com.
Yes. Well, thank you, David Lee. All of those links will be in the show notes for folks, but if you've heard him now, you can go ahead and click over and friend him and follow him and check out his fine art. And movies online, are these movies that folks can find?
Yes, there was one called Rudderless, which was very well received critically. It was out in 2014, I think. That was the first one I did. There are quite a few other, there's the ones that I played a lead character is a recent short film called Assisted Living. And I'm not sure that it's going to, it's right now being played in festivals, so look out for that.
Yeah.
I play an old man, which is my specialty, actually.
Okay, yeah.
An old man who is in an assisted living center, and he gets a roommate who is a young man in his early 30s who is a comic book collector. And he had lost his apartment, so his mother told him about you could live free with this old man. Well, that was a collision of until the two people found out that they enjoyed comic books together.
Okay. Yeah.
So what's interesting is it ties together. I used some of my own Silver Age comics as props in the movie.
Yeah.
So this all, and some of my art, was seen in it. But assisted living is, something I'd recommend if you see that listed in your local film festival.
Excellent. Well, David Lee, thank you so much for your time. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I appreciate you being on the show.
I appreciate you asking me, Charles. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Live Your Purpose podcast. I hope you've been inspired by my conversation with today's guest. If you like what you hear, please share with your social networks and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. I'm your host, Charles Gossett, life purpose coach and founder of Full Integration Coaching. To learn more about the life coaching, public speaking, and retreat services that I offer, visit fullintegrationcoaching.com. And you can follow along with me on Facebook and Instagram at Full Integration Coaching. Until next time, remember, you were meant to live on purpose. Start living yours today.
Then you find your